Thank you for downloading this special edition of A Point of View after the vote from the BBC. The philosopher Roger Scruton gives his personal view of the UK's decision to leave the European Union.
The argument was made during the recent debate that the European Union lacks democratic accountability and that no reforms will ever change this. Those seeking to remain in the Union dismissed the argument as a populist ploy. In such an important matter, they implied, the people should not be consulted since they don't understand what is at stake. It is the experts who must decide. In fact, it was the experts, or at least those wheeled on by the Remainers, who didn't get it, for they failed to see that the British people are profoundly democratic and do not accept to be governed by bureaucrats who are not accountable for their mistakes. Indeed, reading the quantities of anger that have been heaped on the electorate since the vote, we may reasonably wonder whether the social and business elites of our country really believe in democracy. Some have been calling for a second referendum, thereby mimicking the behaviour of the European Union, which, when defeated in a popular vote, calls for the vote to be repeated, so as to give the people the chance to correct their mistake. But it is precisely because the European Union distrusts the people that people distrust the European Union. In modern conditions, in which governments rarely enjoy a majority vote, most of us are living under a government of which we don't approve. We accept to be ruled by laws and decisions made by politicians with whom we disagree, and whom we perhaps deeply dislike. How is that possible? Why don't democracies constantly collapse as people refuse to be governed by those they never voted for? Clearly, a democracy must be held together by something stronger than politics. There has to be a first-person plural, a pre-political loyalty, which causes neighbours who voted in opposing ways to treat each other as fellow citizens, for whom the government is not mine or yours, but ours, whether or not we approve of it. It is true that a country's stability depends to a great extent on economic growth, but it also depends upon social trust, the sense that we belong together and that we will stand by each other in the real emergencies. Social trust comes from shared language, shared customs, instinctive law-abidingness, procedures for resolving disputes and grievances, public spirit, and the ability of the people to change their own government by a process that is transparent to them all. Urban elites build trust through career moves, joint projects, cooperation across borders, and what the philosopher John Stuart Mill called experiments in living. Like the aristocrats of old, they form their networks without reference to national boundaries. They do not, on the whole, depend upon a particular place, a particular faith, or a particular routine for their sense of membership. In the recent vote, they would have experienced little reluctance in saying yes to the European Union, since it threatens their way of life, if at all, only at the margins. However, even in modern conditions, this urban elite depends upon others who do not belong to it. The farmers, manufacturers, clothiers, mechanics, soldiers and administrators for whom attachment to a place and its customs is implicit in all that they do. It is surely not difficult to imagine that in a question of identity, these people will very likely vote in another way from the urban elite, on whom they depend nevertheless for government. An inclusive first-person plural is the residue of cooperation and trust over generations. Those who have guided and inspired the European project have tried to create such a first-person plural by gimmicks and subsidies, while suppressing the national loyalties of the European people. But it is nationality, the home country and its shared culture, that define the true European identity. It astonishes me that so many people fail to see this, or to understand that democracy and national identity, in the end, depend on each other. Europe was set on the path towards democracy by the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which ended the devastating 30 Years' War. The treaty marginalised religion, established a secular rule of law in the sovereign states of Central Europe, and rearranged borders so that nationality rather than faith should become the ground of political allegiance. In all subsequent conflicts, peace has been achieved when the nation-states of Europe have agreed to respect each other's sovereignty and to allow each nation to make its own laws and to live unmolested within its borders. And it has worked, at least for short periods between the conflicts, and will surely continue to work so long as the nation-states are democratically governed. The Treaty of Rome, which founded the European project, was the first real departure from that long-standing peacemaking process. It was not a treaty guaranteeing the sovereignty of its signatories, but a treaty to diminish national sovereignty, with the ultimate aim of destroying it. It was a treaty against the nation-state. It was advertised at first as a customs union, but it soon became clear that those who signed up to the treaty were not merely surrendering their ability to tax the goods crossing their borders. They were surrendering their borders too, and also the right to make laws within them. In short, they were relinquishing national sovereignty in exchange for sovereignty of another kind. But this other kind of sovereignty could never be democratically exercised, since the people would never identify with it as ours. Always those laws handed down from on high would be laws coming from them, in which we had no say. This, in my view, is the real reason why so many people voted to leave the European Union. They were voting for the right to vote on matters of shared national concern. The official story is that the Treaty of Rome aims to regulate trade and commerce between the nation-states, but that in subsidiary matters, where the application of the treaty is not in question, national governments exercise full sovereign choice. As for the European Commission, its directives and regulations are purely technical matters governing the management of the internal market. In such matters, national parliaments have always been happy to delegate to experts. So what is there to worry about? That official story is entirely deceptive. The scope of the treaty is unlimited, since all laws and decisions can be understood as bearing on trade between the nation-states. Thus, free movement of people across national borders has been justified as an integral part of the internal market, while laws concerning the terms and conditions of employment have been used both to impose a moral code of non-discrimination and to penalise people who wish to get ahead by working longer hours than their competitors. In the name of the internal market, we have discovered, people can be bossed about in every aspect of their social being, and no parliament can defend its electorate from this. The metrication directives led to the abolition of long-established customs of our high streets, to great popular discontent. This profound change, which affects not only our historical identity but also our trading relations with America, was branded merely as an adjustment to the internal market. Hence Parliament had no right to question the result, even though it was an affront to the British people, their history, and their long-established patterns of trade. The promise of sovereignty in subsidiary matters is in fact entirely empty. For who decides which matters are subsidiary? Who decides that a nation may pass its own laws when considering the terms of employment contracts or the standards of energy efficiency in buildings? The answer is the European Commission. A government has sovereignty only if the Commission permits it, and that, of course, is not sovereignty at all. The term subsidiarity is a term of newspeak, which means the opposite of what it pretends. It means that national governments are not sovereign at all. Ours is a representative democracy. We elect our representatives to Parliament in order that they should advance our interests there. In this, we are affirming our existence as a we, an electorate bound together by a pre-political loyalty and an identity that we share. Many are the flaws in this system of government, but one feature gives it an insuperable advantage over all others so far devised, which is that it makes everyone who exercises power accountable to the rest of us. That is what the sovereignty of the people means. But the people in question must be bound together as a we, Only if this "we" is in place can the people cooperate in ensuring that the legislative process is both accountable and also reversible when it makes mistakes. It is surely impossible, therefore, that we should be truly represented by the European institutions. The Commission is not elected, and its legislation is neither publicly introduced nor openly discussed. There is no organised opposition, and no clear procedure for correcting mistakes or for rejecting those who make them. And there is no way of rectifying these defects, since there is no "we" who can insist on another arrangement. All that we, the people, can do is to get our governments to withdraw from the treaty. And this points us to the strangeness of the whole arrangement. In a parliamentary democracy, legislation changes and constitutions evolve according to the will of the people. But when legislation is controlled by a treaty, and the treaty itself can be changed only by majority vote of the signatories, the legislative process rapidly stagnates, proceeding with an agenda that has never adapted to the changed conditions of Europe and which cannot adapt to them now. We have seen this in connection with what for us is the most critical feature of the Treaty of Rome, namely that providing for freedom of movement within the Union, which has stimulated an unprecedented tide of immigration into this country, which we have no legal power to limit. Nobody foresaw the effect of this provision when the original treaty was signed, but nobody can undo the provision just because it is leading to a demographic catastrophe. We must go on following the instructions, even though they were written in another world by people long since dead. Many will say that in a representative democracy, referendums are only dubiously legitimate, and indeed this is true. For referendums deny the right of legislators to make informed decisions without consulting the people, something that they must feel free to do if they are to be genuinely accountable. However, there is one circumstance in which only a referendum can answer the need of the moment, and that is when what has to be decided is the question, who has the right to decide? Who, in other words, is part of the "we"? To answer this question, we must appeal directly to the people. That is why we had a referendum on Scotland's membership of the United Kingdom, and why we have had a referendum on our membership of the European Union. The appeal to the people is especially important now, when so many have seen their worlds turned upside down by the global economy. For many of them, their old attachments have been disturbed, their sense of place and home has been disrupted, and yet they, as much as the elites, want to live life to the full and to be at peace with their neighbours. The referendum gave these people a voice, and what they have told us is that their country, its laws, and its sovereignty are more important to them than the edicts of anonymous bureaucrats striving to rule them from nowhere. Our metropolitan elites would happily discard such people, in the way that the Labour Party, in the discussions over the referendum, seemed happy to discard the indigenous working class, and to speak for the multinational restaurateurs of Islington rather than the struggling factory workers of our northern cities. But there is no way of forcing onto people forms of attachment that are not generic to their way of life. We must therefore work to include the ordinary people for whom this country is an inheritance and a home in the decisions made in their name. Can it be done? Well, one thing is certain, it was not being done by the European Union. In this matter, at least, things can only get better.
A Point of View After the Vote was written and presented by Roger Scruton. The producer was Adele Armstrong. And you can find the other talks in this special series on the Radio 4 website.